You are here for today's webinar entitled One Step at a Time, Remote Tutoring for Literacy Level Learners. We have the pleasure of having Andrea Eckelberger with Literacy Minnesota as our presenter today. My name is Paula Bauer. I am the host for the webinar this afternoon, and I have two wonderful co-workers, Beth Ponder and Tracy Hendricks, that will be helping me with this webinar. So fasten your seatbelts and be ready for a great ride. I now want to introduce our presenter, Miss Andrea Eckelberger, and we'd like to welcome you today, Andrea. Andrea is the ESL training coordinator at Literacy Minnesota. She helps the adults and the volunteers, the adult language teachers and the volunteers in Minnesota. She's been in the field of adult ed since 2003 and has worked with the U.S. State Department EL Specialist Program in Cambodia, Thailand, and the Philippines. Andrea's primary focus is in adult emergent teachers, pronunciation, and equity in the adult basic ed field. We are very fortunate to have you, Miss Andrea. We appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the welcome. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just give a really very brief background on the organization I work for, which is Literacy Minnesota. So Literacy Minnesota has been around since 1972. So we are almost 50 years old at this point. And we do a lot of stuff in the field of literacy. My primary area is working with adult ESL. So I do the tutor training for that and the volunteer training for that. But Literacy Minnesota also does extensive work with supporting programs that are doing distance learning. And our distance learning person has been incredibly busy over the past year. She no longer has to beg programs to do distance learning. And we do quite a bit of work with advocacy. So advocacy at the state level, and then also at the national level for adult basic education, particularly with trying to make sure that there is enough funding for programs and nonprofits to be able to do this great work. So thank you for joining me today. And we are going to be talking about literacy level learners. And so talking about literacy level learners, what is a literacy level learner? What do we mean? So literacy level learners are people who have had little to no prior formal education. So this means that most of them are learning to read fluently for the first time in their life as an adult. And there are so many other ways that they're referred to. Some of the acronyms that you might not be familiar with are SLIFE, students with limited or interrupted formal education. That might be people who come up through the K-12 system. And then LESLA, literacy education and second language learning for adults. But there's a lot of other things, pre-beginning, pre-literacy, emergent readers, adult emergent readers. But essentially what we're talking about is people who have not had an opportunity to become readers or writers, to become literate in their first language, and then are in the process of becoming literate in a new language that they are also learning to speak at the same time. So as you will probably imagine, there are some pretty big differences and similarities between literate and non-literate people who are literacy level learners. So people who are literate, and I want to emphasize that this is kind of in general, and there's definitely going to be people who are exceptions to both of these. But in general, people who are literate in our first language tend to learn from print. And people who are literacy level, who are learning to read and write for the first time in their life as adults, tend to learn by doing and watching, more of that hands-on learning. People who are literate tend to be visually oriented, so that I learn by looking at stuff, I learn by reading something, I have to write it down. Literacy level learners tend to be more orally oriented, so that learn by hearing things. Literate level learners will often make lists, make notes to remember things. Literacy level learners generally tend to repeat to remember. And this can be pretty incredible. I've had learners in my classes who would be considered literacy level, pre-literate, who have the entire Quran memorized. And so we are talking about hundreds of hours that they are able to say out loud. People who are literate spend years learning to read. And when you think about this, how old are our children when they start to do pre-reading skills, when they start getting exposure to literacy? Yep, I'm saying 2, 3. Yeah, so generally really young. If you've had children or have memories, obviously there is the look, my name is Andrea. Look, it's an A like Andrea. Reading to children from print books, listening to books on tape and having children follow along, like any sort of games you're playing, singing the alphabet song, all of that is building literacy skills and building pre-literacy skills. So we say children start learning to read at 3 years old, start building those pre-literacy skills at 3 years old, and then are generally fluent readers 3rd, 4th grade. Obviously, it's going to change from person to person, but we're talking 7, 8 years of reading instruction, of learning to read. And then literacy level adults who are learning to read and write for the first time in their life as adults are generally expected to do that in a very short period of time, where they might be coming to class, anywhere from 3 to 10 hours a week, and are expected to become literate in 6 months to a year. So we're talking very, very different amounts of time that people have to learn to read. Literate learners know they can learn. They have been through school. They have successfully learned how to read. They've learned in an educational setting. Where people who are literacy level may lack confidence in their reading ability and in their learning ability in an educational setting. Literate learners learn best when content is relevant to their lives. Literacy level learners, so this is our similarity, also learn best when content is relevant to their lives. And literate level learners generally have kind of some advantages when it comes to being able to distinguish between important and less important points of information. So for example, being able to tell what on a page is the instructions and then what they should be focusing on for the content of being able to dive in. Whereas literacy level learners may accept all content of being of equal value because they don't not having that strong background of kind of knowing what a worksheet looks like. So definitely a lot of differences and similarities between people who are learning a new language as an adult when they're literate in their first language, no matter how different that language is from English, and people who are literacy level, who are learning to read and write for the first time in their life as an adult who have not previously learned to read or write. So then a question is always, well, how long does it take for adults to become literate? And it's a while. I mean, we talked about how long it takes children to become literate. So, and the estimate is that non-literate and low literacy adults need upwards of 850 hours of instruction and some over 2,000 hours to gain basic literacy skills. And when we're talking about basic literacy skills, we're talking about being able to do simple decoding, read signs around the house, fill out a very basic form, not necessarily fluent readers, but able to can get by with very basic literacy skills. So if there's one thing I really want to kind of have all of us be keeping in mind as we're going through this training is that literacy level learners may be beginning learners, but they are not beginning thinkers. So this is one of the really big differences between working with adults who are learning to read and working with children that are learning to read. That, adults have a wealth of experience, of life experience and educational experience, even if it doesn't look like formal education, that they are bringing with them into the classroom. And that is a huge advantage because we can tap into that when we are working on developing literacy skills. So definitely keeping that in mind, that even if somebody doesn't know how to read or write, there are so many skills and so many strengths that they are carrying with them into the classroom, and making sure that we are acknowledging, we are lifting that up, and then we are tapping into that as we're doing instruction. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about some best communication practices for literacy level learners. So for the next 3 minutes, I am going to ask you to put yourselves into the shoes of somebody who is in the first day of class and learning a brand new language. So because this is a bigger group, I'm not going to make anybody turn on your cameras, and I'm not going to make you unmute yourself. But what I'm going to do is trust that you are doing this with me. So you are going to get a lot more out of this experience if you are doing this at home, and going through this little 3-minute long language lesson together and actually following my instructions and speaking out loud. So I'm going to give you a little lesson, and then we're going to unpack it and then start to talk about what are some of the best practices that we can use for communicating, and then what are some of the best practices that we can use for teaching people who are literacy level. All right, is everybody ready to be a language learner? Walage. Walage, yemi me Andrea. Yemi me Andrea. Andrea. Yemi me Andrea. Walage. Walage, yemi me kuse. Takulati bana, yemi me lermu. Takulati bana. Walage. Walage, yemi me kuse. Takulati bana, yemi me lermu. Takulati bana. Walage. Walage, yemi me kuse. Takulati bana, yemi me lermu. Takulati bana. Walage. Walage. Yemi me kuse. Takulati bana. Saku lati bana. Takulati bana. Takulati bana. Yemi me lermu. Takulati bana. Walage. Walage. Yemi me kuse. Takulati bana. Yemi me kuse. Takulati bana. Walage. Walage, yemi me kuse. Takulati bana, yemi me lermu. Thakulati bana. Kwalage. Kwalage yemi me kuse. Takulati bana yemi me lermu. Takulati bana. Lermu. Andrea, lermu. Kuse. Kuse. Andrea lermu. Kuse. Gualage. Fakulati bana yemi me lermu. Lermu kuse. Gualage. Fakulati bana yemi me lermu. All right. Let's go ahead and go back to English. So we're going to switch back to English. And I'm just going to apologize right now for anybody who jumped in right before that or right at the end of it and had no idea what we were doing. We were just doing a little language immersion lesson, and everybody just learned how to say a few phrases in the Karen language. So you learned how to say a few things in Karen, and Karen is a language from Burma. So I would love just in the chat for everybody to put a word, an adjective to describe how you felt during our 3-minute language lesson. What is an adjective you would use to describe how you felt? Okay, I'm definitely seeing a pattern. Confused is popular, lost, disoriented, some interesting or interested, some people excited. Yeah, so if you felt confused, if you felt lost or disoriented, that is totally normal. It is a challenge to jump in and do language immersion as an adult when you are learning something brand new. And particularly when we're teaching online, there are some challenges that are even more apparent than they are in person. But there are some things that we can do that are going to make it easier for people to be able to learn. And also easier for us to communicate. And I see a few people saying that the pictures helped, that they felt like maybe at first they weren't sure, and then being able to see the pictures was very helpful. So that is some great foreshadowing for some of the things we're going to be talking about later. So when you're working with people who are literacy level, who are, again, kind of at the very beginning of their English language journey, some things to remember are slow it down. And I saw someone putting, Dana, that couldn't differentiate individual words. And again, that is totally normal. When you are hearing a new language, it can sound really fast, and it is very hard to pick out those word boundaries. So obviously, don't slow it down to the point that your speech starts to get distorted, but think about, maybe the first time you say something, or just slowing down and being a little bit more deliberate with your speech for people who haven't had a lot of practice listening and are still struggling to differentiate where one word ends and the next one begins. Also, a big thing is to allow for wait time and allow for silence. And I feel like this can be really challenging. I know it's something I had to struggle with a lot as a teacher, working with literacy level learners, is that silence can feel really weighted, and we need to jump in and make sure that we're always feeling that silence. But when someone is in the process of learning a new language, there's just a ton of cognitive processing that is happening. And we need to make sure that we are having those pauses where that processing is allowed to happen instead of always jumping in and rephrasing or calling on someone. Don't be afraid of having some silence in the classroom. So when I was doing this demonstration, how much language did you hear me use for giving you instructions and telling you what we were going to do and defining things? You see very little. Yeah, none. So the only thing I was saying to you was I was only telling you what I wanted you to learn. So I see the gestures to the camera helped. So something to be keeping in mind when you're working with people who have limited language skills, who are kind of, again, at the beginning of that language journey, is really be mindful of your teacher talk and mindful of talk time. That a little bit of language can really quickly get overwhelming, and it's hard to know what's important, what should I focus on, and what is not important, what's content and what's the superfluous. So definitely be aware of how much are you talking, and as much as possible, can you show instead of tell. And in our dialogue, how many new words do you think you learned? How many new words do you think there were in the dialogue? This group was way closer than most groups, but I see there's still a stretch. So there were 8 new words, and that's six kind of vocabulary words, and then 2 names. So there were 8 new words total, because there was some repetition in that dialogue. But I know I definitely saw for some people, you're able to guess pretty accurately. And for some people, it felt like more. And so something to be keeping in mind when somebody is, again, sort of at the beginning of a journey, just starting out with learning some new language, a little bit can really feel like more than it is. So remembering that less is more. It's better to have less vocabulary, less phrases, less language in the lesson, and give people lots of opportunities to really master it, feel like they understand it, do that very needful and intentional repetition, rather than introduce so much stuff that people leave feeling like, I don't really know what happened. And I don't understand anything. So just remember, like, a little bit can feel like a lot more than it is to somebody who's learning the language. And then the final thing to be keeping in mind is try to avoid overly simplifying your speech. And this is something that I hear teachers and tutors, and I've been working in the field for a long time, and I still have to work on, because it's very much coming from a good place, that I want to make my language as simple as possible. But if you are talking to somebody who is learning a language and you start to overly simplify your speech, so for example, saying, "Oh, you go bus today?" You go bus, that's not modeling, it's not necessarily modeling clear language. And the other thing is that it can really sound patronizing. It can sound like almost like baby talk. So make sure that no matter what level you're working with, you are not simplifying your speech to the point where it starts to sound really artificial. We also want people to be able to have authentic language examples from their teachers and from their tutors. So keeping in mind that, communicating with a language learner, particularly someone who's just starting out, it's a skill, and it's just like any skill. It takes some time to build and to work on. And like I said, any muscle, you've got to build it up. So even if at the beginning it feels like, how am I ever going to figure this out? The more you practice, the more you do it, the easier and more natural it becomes. So let's take a quick pause. Let's go to the chat. So wondering if people can share two things. What will be your biggest communication challenge? So we talked about things like slow it down, less is more, don't overly simplify speech, watch your teacher talk, all of those things. What for you, what do you think will be your biggest challenge, and what will you do to improve it? Yeah, so teacher talk, less is more. I'm seeing less is more a lot. The wait time. I'll just go back through these. Avoid oversimplifying speech, less is more, talk time, wait time, and slow it down. Right, so I'm definitely seeing less is more. Teacher talk online is definitely a challenge, even more so than in person. I feel like that those silences online can feel almost even more uncomfortable. And trying to be mindful, doing training and wait time, that deliberate with wait time and making sure you're selecting short sentences. Yeah, wait time can be very difficult. Yeah, and I know that particularly when you're starting off a language, it can be really uncomfortable. There is a huge vulnerability in learning a new language as an adult, particularly for somebody who hasn't had a lot of experience in it before. It's scary. And it is really, really uncomfortable. So you might find yourself using a lot of wait time. You are probably going to need to provide opportunities for people to practice something by themselves or practice with a partner before they speak in front of a group. So knowing that and thinking back on that experience that you had with learning a little bit of Karen, it probably would have been hard for you to say that out loud in front of a group. So definitely kind of keep that in mind as you're working with learners. All right, so we talked about communication, best practices for communication. Now let's look at some best practices for teaching. So there are 6 things we're going to focus on today. I'm going to be giving examples of how we can use all of them in a classroom. And they are: teach within a context, make the connection between oral and written language meaningful, build from knowledge, talents, and interests, repetition is key, focus on communication, and also make it visual. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to unpack each one of these, and I'm going to give some really clear examples of ways that you can use this when you are teaching in a literacy level classroom. A lot of my examples are coming from online work, but that I have in the PowerPointer for online, but you can do all of them and apply all of this in person as well. And I'll also be sharing some personal examples from that. Okay, so let's look at our first one, which is teach within a context. So even if your learners don't know the alphabet, focus first on the meaning. So choosing a central theme, and this could be food, homes, community, and shopping, and then teach language skills using vocabulary and phrases that relate to the theme. So what does this look like when we're teaching? So a big one, kind of that number one place to start if you want to be teaching within a context and make sure that you are teaching themes that are of interest to learners, is find out what people are looking for. What do people want to learn? And so think about asking WH questions. And if you're working with people who have limited language skills, this might be something that's really helpful to have an interpreter help you with. But rather than asking those really broad questions, like what do you want to learn? Think about asking WH questions that are going to give you much more information, such as where do you need to speak English, or what do you want to do in English? Who do you need to talk to? When have you had problems because of English? And you might want to use something like an example picture story. So we have Ahmed wants to learn English to get a job, take his child to the doctor, and to talk with his neighbors. This is why Ahmed wants to learn English. Why do you want to learn English? And so when you're picking out those themes, again, rather than picking out themes that you think will be of interest to the learners, pick out themes that you are hearing from the learners that they want to dig into, and then have your vocabulary, everything kind of pulled from that theme. So what are some different themes you might use with a literacy level learner that people would be interested in? Go ahead and share some ideas in the chat. Talking to the doctor, time, places and locations, personal information, weather, health, education, community, holidays, talking to the teacher. Food is always a very, very popular topic. Healthcare, education and tools, recipes, being able to talk about native cultures, native countries, daily living, activities, being able to order in a restaurant. Excellent. Yep. Routines. What do you do each day? Being able to talk about those. Employment. Talking about current and past employment. Yeah, excellent. So we have all of these ideas, and you'll be able to really prioritize if you're able to check in with learners and ask some of those WH questions. And that is how you can help set your themes. When I was in person, one of my favorite ways to do this is I would put up different pictures that were print off and put up different pictures that were representations of themes. Everybody would get 3 stickers and they would literally go up and vote. So they'd pick the ones that were the most important to them. And then whatever themes got the most picture or the most stickers, whether that if that was healthcare, finding a job, food, shopping, money, that is what I would prioritize and what we would focus on first. All right, let's go on to our next best practice, which is build from talents, knowledge, and interests. So after you know a little bit more about your learners, you can use as information to teach lessons that interest them and that also motivate people to learn. Do you have a former farmer or somebody who is a mechanic in the group? You can do a unit on gardening their cars. Or extend a textbook reading lesson by having students talk and write about their own experiences. So what does this look like when we're teaching remotely? So when we are building from what people already know. So a big thing that we can do that's an incredibly helpful strategy to use with people who are literacy level is to use something called student-generated text, which can also be called the language experience approach, or LEA. So LEA is when people are sharing a personal story, a shared experience, picture stories, responding to a picture in a photo, or completing sentence frames to be able to create together the text that then is going to be used in class. So there are a lot of advantages to LEA. Materials are really highly relevant. Put together all of the communication skills, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. How challenging the grammar and vocabulary are determined by learners' own language use. Learning and teaching are personalized, communicative, and creative, and it tends to be really highly motivating to learners. For example, that personal story, I had a learner who came in one day. She'd been out for a few days, and I was like, "Oh, where were you? I missed you. Is everything okay?" And she was telling me a story about her sister who lived in the same apartment building as she did, who had a new baby, and the baby was born in the bathtub because the ambulance didn't get there in time. And she was telling the story, and she had fairly limited language skills in English. So she would say something in English, and then she would turn and she was talking to the rest of the class in her first language. And then the rest of the class was like working together and coming up with the story to tell me. And so they told me the story. I ended up writing it down, and we used that as our text, as our story for the week, was the story about she's sister who had a baby in the bathtub. and we were doing a healthcare unit, so it matched up perfectly, talking about calling 911 and the ambulance, and healthy, the baby was healthy. And the interest that everybody had in the story, and the interest that that learner had in the story, having a story about her life and about something that had happened to people in the community, was so much different than having a story out of a book that has nothing that's really related to people's lives. And so here's some other examples. So this is doing a story from a picture prompt, and learners are sharing what they see in the picture. And then the story is being written together. The teacher is writing down what they hear. Here's some examples from when I was tutoring a few literacy level learners this summer. We were doing picture stories. And so there were kind of two ways that I was doing these stories. One is I would have a conversation, and then I would write a story based on the conversation. So that is on the right, where we had a conversation and the learner had given me a little tour. We were on WhatsApp. She'd given me a tour of her apartment, and then I wrote up a story based on that. And that was the story that we worked on and practiced doing our phonics and spelling and everything from. And then the picture on the left is from a different learner who sent me pictures of things in her apartment. And then we wrote a story together. So these are actually screenshots from when I was working with them on WhatsApp and taking some screenshots where I'm holding my phone up to my computer and using my phone almost as a projector so that we can read and look at things together. And then here's an example of what that picture story would look like. So this is one that I took pictures of my husband cooking dinner for a food unit that I was doing with a learner. And I showed the pictures and I talked about what happened. And we wrote a story together. And it has a happy ending, just like any good story. And then out of that, we were able to do a lot of vocabulary activities. So if you're using Zoom, or if you are having people do in-person instruction, you can use the annotate tool or have people on a piece of paper circle the picture. So you can say things like onion, and they circle onion, or tomato, they circle the tomato. Or you can do it as a speaking activity. What's number 1? What's number 5? You can do matching activities using language from the story. You can do close activities with letters or full words. You can have people do activities where they are circling the words, and this can be phonics based. Circle the words that have the p sound in them, or circle the word tomatoes, circle garlic. And even do things like a word search where people are identifying, practicing doing that scanning, looking for the letters, and then being able to spell the word. So I'm going to pause again. Does anyone have any ideas of other activities that we could use to practice the language in the story? Yep, you could rewrite the story with new information. Absolutely. Do a role play. Have people make a video performing those actions to show understanding. And this is where it's great doing remote teaching. Everyone's getting so used to using their phone. You can do so much stuff with that and have so much fun doing homework and stuff in between. Have students ask each other simple questions. And in that one, or as example, circle the onion, you could have learners asking those questions. Put together a shopping list. Yeah, do that pair work where people are working together. Great. Yeah, so we can take a text that's been created by learners, and then we can do all sorts of different activities that are going to reinforce the language in there and get people to practice it while using kind of authentic, interesting stories and authentic, interesting languages. And yeah, do a scavenger hunt, particularly if you're doing something where people have items in their apartment. If you're working at home or in their kitchen, they can go and just show things with their cameras. Great ideas. All right, so let's look at our third one, which is make the connection between oral and written language meaningful. So if you're working with students who have limited or no literacy skills, you really want to think about focusing on the oral language before moving to the print and moving to literacy. So you want to make sure that people understand a word before you're asking them to read it. So, for example, a while ago, we did our 3-minute language lesson. I'm sure everybody remembers it very vividly. Would it have been helpful for you to see it written down? Would you have liked to have seen it written while we were going through it? Okay, this is a trick question, because if we were doing a Karen lesson, I see, yep, Lydia, it depends. Here's what I would have shown you. This is what that would have looked like, because we would be using the Karen script, which is very, very different from English. So if I would have started showing this, if I would have put this up on the screen rather than the pictures, and I would have read this out loud, Gwalage, gwalage, yemi me kuse, takuleti bena, yemi me lermu, takuleti bena. Would you have had any idea what you were saying? It would have, yeah, I'm seeing, nope, no. It would have just been making sounds and just kind of repeating what the teacher said with no meaning to it. So we want to make sure that we're always kind of starting with that oral language. We're always starting with making sure people know what something means before we move on to attaching literacy to it. And this really helps with making the learning concrete. And this ties into just kind of basic second language acquisition. You know, that when we're second language acquisition, that when we're learning something, first we have to literally be able to hear it, and not just listen to, but to hear it and to hear the different sounds that are in the word. And then we want to be able to say it. And then we would move on to reading it. And then the last thing we would do would be to write it, to produce it written. And particularly when somebody is not literate in their first language, this order is kind of even more important, because if we are asking people to read a word, to decode and sound out a word, even if it's like C-A-T, so k-at, cat, and somebody reads that word out loud, but they've never learned what cat means in English, it's just a sound. It has no meaning. So people aren't actually reading at that point. So it's really, really important to make sure that we're always starting with the meaning. What does this word mean? What does this phrase mean? Before we are moving it into, now let's read the word. Because yeah, reading something without knowing what it means, decoding a word without knowing what it means, is just making meaningless sounds. It's not actually reading. So here are some examples of after meaning has been made, then starting to do some writing. And so on the picture on the left, this is again from when I was tutoring this summer with some literacy level learners. We were talking about clothing. I was going into my closet and pulling things out and putting it on. We were talking about it. And then after we had talked about it and the learner was saying it out loud, then I was sending her the word. And on the picture on the right, this was after we had done the she had sent me pictures. We had written a story about what was in her house. We had read it multiple times. Then we were doing some writing where I would say a word and help her spell it. And then I would show her the word and she would compare what she saw me write with what she wrote. But all of that came after the let's look and talk about it first. Let's start with the pictures and start with meaning. So I'm going to play a short video so that you can hear somebody who is a teacher, who is a literacy level tutor, talk about how she uses that language experience approach and combines that with starting with the oral meaning in order to help literacy make sense, the English literacy makes sense.
Hello, my name is Marion, and I'm a volunteer at the Northside Open Door program of Literacy Minnesota. Over the past months, pre-COVID, I was working as a volunteer teaching a small group of pre-literate students and helping out in a beginner level class. In that class, I was assigned to sit next to an older, dignified Oromo man named Haicho. And it was clear when we were in class that he was parroting and he had certainly was interested, but he was not reading and not really understanding what was being said. Well, then everything came to a screeching halt when COVID hit us all. North had to close, and our director, Lloyd, came up with the idea that we could do some individual tutoring and asked me if I would work with Haicho again. So he and I got some training, and I got from Minnesota Literacy. I also got to shadow someone for a little while they helped me kind of figure out how to do things online. And we worked on WhatsApp on our telephones. And it turned out that Haicho knows a lot more about WhatsApp than I do, because that's how he communicates with his family back in Ethiopia. For a few months, we worked on that small screen, but he was having trouble hearing and really had to look at this tiny screen to try to read the stories that we were reading and the letters we were working on. And finally, he got access to a computer. So now we work on Zoom, and that's great because he hears well and he has a nice big screen to read from. Well, since we've been working together, he lives with his adult children and grandchildren, doesn't go out to work or do shopping. So I write stories for him that relate to his life and use the easy words that are the key words he needs to learn. And he is doing incredibly. He is now really reading. He can read most of the early keywords and can sort of slowly work through words that have a lot of syllables. I don't know that he comprehends them. So I found online an Oromo phrase app and also an Oromo dictionary. And so now I've got English words and Oromo words. He doesn't know how to read Oromo. He didn't go to school when he was young. So he reads the English words, then he reads the Oromo words, and then he recognizes the words he knows, which is really fun and exciting. And then he gets what we're trying to get across as he's learning English. So we're really having a good time together, and we've decided that we're going to be each other's teachers. So he is my Oromo Bashisha. Isn't that a beautiful word? Bashisha. It means teacher. And I am his English teacher. And we actually have a good laugh a lot of the time when I have just as much of a challenge learning the Oromo as he has learning the English. But the truth is, he has made incredible progress in these months, because I can spend two days a week, I spend an hour with him, and he always wants to go longer than we can, but I have to go to work. And so he's making great progress, and we've established a really fun relationship, and I've even had a chance to meet a couple of his adult children who have gone through the same Minnesota literacy program and are bilingual. So it's really a great experience.
All right, so hearing from Marion, You can hear how she's using that language experience approach to write stories that are meaningful. And then she is using that oral phrase book to make sure that there is always meaning connected to the words that they are learning. And the best part about this is the learner that she's working with, who she describes as pre-literate, which is that literacy level learner, is actually moved up to the next level, is testing in the next level, and is now in a instead of a pre-beginning class, is in a beginning level class. He has gained decoding skills from doing 2 hours a week of one-on-one instruction with her. So it's made a huge difference. And it's really, yes. And I also love success stories, and it's really exciting to hear that. So we're on to number 4, principle number 4. And just want to remind people that everything that was shared at the beginning, what I'm talking about, you can get a PDF, and you can also get a handout that talks about what I'm discussing here if you want to have something to go back and remind you of. But so next, before we move on to the next one, I want us to remember back to our 3-minute language lesson in Karen. How many times did we repeat the story or repeat the dialogue together? So how many times did we repeat the dialogue, and did it feel like enough? Did it feel like we repeated it enough, or could you have used more? Okay, so yes, we repeated it about 10 times before I even had you go ahead and take on one of the parts. And I'm seeing people could have used more, trying to listen for patterns. Yeah, so something to keep in mind is that repetition when you're learning a language is huge. It is so important and so essential. And that people who are kind of at the start of learning language are going to need a lot of repetition. I imagine for most people, if I would have said, you're going to hear an 8-word dialogue and you're going to hear it 10 times, most people would have said, that's a lot. But after going through the experience, what I find, and me personally for myself, is like, can I hear it 10 more? Okay, great. How about 10 more? So that repetition is just really, really necessary with learning a new language. And try to think about, instead of doing 10 different brand new things, try to do the same thing in 10 different ways. So always going back and recycling and reviewing previously studied material, daily and weekly and monthly. That repetition is just incredibly important to remember and get a chance to review. And I see Danielle put, greeting and phrases and dialogues are definitely harder than individual vocabulary words. But exactly what you're saying, they tend to be longer. We want to make sure that we are definitely teaching those as chunks. So instead of teaching them an individual word, teach them as a chunk, and then give lots and lots of chances to repeat it and to practice it over and over and over and over again. So think about trying to establish routines. And establishing routines is so important for a variety of reasons. But one, it lets learners, and particularly, again, people who are literacy level learners, focus on the content, because they're not worried about what am I supposed to do? What's the next step? They can just focus on what they're supposed to be remembering or the language they're practicing. It helps to create ownership, because when there's a solid routine and people know what to expect and know what to happen, what that means is that they are then able to step up and kind of take on different parts of that routine. Or if there's a new learner in the class, they can help and support the new learner because they know what's going on. Also extremely important for people, for all learners, but thinking about trauma-informed teaching, and thinking about people who might not have had many previous or many positive prior educational experiences, it really helps manage anxiety. knowing what is going to be happening each day instead of coming into class and being like, I don't know what's going to happen. Am I going to be able to do it? Am I going to understand the teacher today? I don't know. So having routines really helps with managing that anxiety. And when you have routines, it's less learner management, which naturally makes for less teacher talk, that you don't have to explain, okay, here's what we're going to do next. I'm going to need 2 volunteers to come up to the front of the room and read the questions for the calendar. You can just say calendar time and, 2 people, and have 2 people come on up. And it also, when you have those routines, it really provides a lot of that just natural repetition where people get a chance to say and to practice the language over and over and over again. That's so necessary for learning a new language. So looking at a program that has been doing in Minnesota that has been doing literacy level, has a multi-level class of beginning level and literacy level learners that is doing teaching on Zoom. One of the things she does is she has a routine where she is using Bow Valley readers. And so in the Zoom class, they do daily practice reading a Bow Valley story, plus doing a lot of interactive activities, kind of like what we were looking at earlier with the different activities for the story about pasta. She has a website that people can access that has the story and then the daily homework. Also sends links to learners' phones that leads to the story and the homework. And then actually also sends things out in the mail to people so that they have that story in hard copies of the homework. So the Bow Valley Readers, and I have a link to it later on if it's something you want to check out. So some ways to build in that repetition are to stay with the same story for a stretch of time. Rather than read different texts, do a lot of different activities based on the same text. So that instead of doing 10 different things, do one thing in 10 different ways. And I remember when I was teaching a large literacy level class in person a number of years ago. I had about 30 students in my class, most of them who were newly arrived refugees from Burma. And I'd started doing a story a week where on Monday we would create the story together and then we would use that story and read it multiple times, do activities out of it for the rest of the week. And a learner said to me one day, 1 week, 1 story, I understand. So I was really worried that for the learners, it was going to get boring. We're reading the same story. They're going to get tired of it. And what I was actually getting was more participation and more enthusiasm because people really deeply appreciated the fact that by the end of the week, they understood and could pick up the story and read. And that was really highly motivating and much more motivating than doing multiple stories and introducing multiple readings. And then with multi-level classes, because oftentimes it's very common to have people who might be literacy level learners working with people who have literacy in their first language, and that can actually look really different. So what Miriam does is creating a curriculum with a variety of literacy needs and levels. So for example, for literacy level learners, you might be doing simple close exercises or answering yes or no questions. Why higher level learners might be taking vocabulary from the same, all working on the same story, but putting that in alphabetical order. And then again, repeating activities from week to week, not feeling like we always have to be bringing in all brand new activities, but do repeating activities so that learners can concentrate on the vocabulary and the phrases they're using instead of having to worry about the instructions. So looking at another example of a program in Minnesota, and this one is from Moorhead, that is a literacy level program. And she has people meeting on Google Meet, and I got to sit in on one of her classes, and she had 17 native Somali speakers who were all on Google Meet. And at the same time, they were turning their cameras on and off. I was so impressed and so excited to see people muting and unmuting. And this was like back at the beginning of the pandemic. And I heard a lot from people saying literacy level learners are never going to be able to master it. And they did. It just took a lot of practice and repetition. But she has a really set routine for when she was in person, and then when she's teaching online, that they always start with greetings and welcoming each other. They do the calendar and the weather. They do a simple dictation activity. They do a question and picture of the day. They do some reading and grammar work, and then phonics and sight words, where they have their kind of weekly story that they use, and then she pulls out activities from that. So those are the routines that she uses during her in-class synchronous time, and then also sends out homework, asynchronous materials for people to be able to do homework by the U.S. Postal Service, and also includes little notes for learners so that they will kind of get reinforced when they're supposed to come to class and have that personal connection. All right, so we are going to talk about our 5th best teaching practice, which is focusing on communication. And so this is tying into what I was talking about before, where make sure you start with meaning before you move to literacy. Make sure you're also spending a lot of time focusing on communication. And I know that it can be challenging because this might not be necessarily what's being tested, but it's so important because verbal skills pave the way for literacy. So using gestures, using pictures, anything that you need to communicate, and getting people to be able to talk about their families, their home, foods, hobbies, just trying to get people comfortable and feeling safe talking as much as possible. So this means you want to be building speaking and listening skills, and thinking about teaching any new words using pictures like we did in our lesson. And I saw people saying that the pictures were really helpful, and real life items. And when you're teaching remotely, this I found out this summer is absolutely fantastic. Like, we could be talking about something and I could go and find it in my house and show it on my phone. And I was like, I wish I would have had access to this when I was teaching in person. Use total physical response, which is TPR, which is having people do listening and following, like stand up, sit down, pick up, put down. I've done practice with this with driving a car for turn right, turn left, turn on your lights, stop, go, check your blind spot. And this summer I did some fun stuff, and I've done some things in person where you're like, let's make tea. Like, show me what you're doing, and let's talk about it as you're doing it. Practicing simple dialogues and doing lots of repetition with the simple dialogues, and then using sentence frames and using lots of repetition. So we're going to look and we're going to talk about the picture, and every time we're going to use some of the same sentence frames over and over again so that people don't have to think about the first part of the sentence. They can just concentrate on the language they're using. So here's an example from another program in Minnesota. So some of the things that she did is she would send messages to learners, and she would send a picture, and then also send it written, and then do a recording of it. So you can see on the right, picture, and then saying what she had for dinner, and then a recording so that students can see it, can read it, and can listen to it. And then, on the left, and then on the right, she did a simple dialogue, and then had herself and her husband record it so learners could look at the dialogue, but also had the chance to read it, could read it and also could listen to it as well. So again, using those kind of same prompts, same repetition, and these are some of the examples that Amy shared that she uses with her class. And something that was really powerful for me when I was talking to Amy about what she uses and how she picks out pictures and picks out visuals, is she said, I always really try to make sure that when I'm finding things that we're going to talk about, and when I'm finding picture prompts to get us speaking, I try to make sure I find beautiful pictures, because everybody needs beautiful things in their life and needs to be able to look at beautiful things. So she always tries to make sure she's finding beautiful, high quality pictures. And I want to play I'm going to play a short video from one of my colleagues at Literacy Minnesota. And she is doing some conversation, some speaking practice with her beginning level and literacy level class. So this is working with a few students, but I'm going to play it so that you can hear the level of language that she is using in it.
Something you can show us and talk about?
Vui có tay nè. Father, teacher.
What is it?
I don't know, teacher. Syria.
Cereal.
Yes.
Cereal.
Syria.
Can you tell me more?
Bello para nyima.
A container?
Tango.
Container. Container.
No.
Container.
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 Mm-hmm. Container. Mm-hmm. What color do you see?
White.
Okay, kind of white. How about on top?
Right.
Right.
Okay, good. Preme, what did you hear?
Report say you have a container. You open you push a cereal ink. Yes. Every morning she showed it. Right? I don't know. Teacher.
Very good. You're telling more. Yes, we eat cereal in the morning.
Mhm.
Very good. Shang, what did you hear with Pui Pa?
So I don't know, teacher.
What does she have?
She has bottle. I think he get something in the bottle.
Yeah, she has a bottle.
Yeah.
She has something in the bottle. Do you remember the name? What is in the bottle?
Celia.
Cereal. Cereal. Very good.
Children eat.
The children eat.
Ah.
Very good. Thank you, Pui Pa. That was good.
So being able to hear an example of what practicing those oral skills can sound like when working with people who are just kind of starting out their journey, might have some limited language skills, but that doesn't mean that you can't have lots of opportunities to practice talking and speaking and building up that confidence. And then also want to talk about the last topic, the show, don't tell. And so this ties in a lot to what we've been talking about in our time together today. So that knowing that people might have had a lot of schooling, other people might have had very little or none, and that can really limit people's ability to learn through reading. So think about trying to, adjust your lessons to tap into visual and hands-on learners by making literacy and learning as visible as possible. So one thing to think about, if you remember at the beginning, we did our 3-minute activity, and a few people said the pictures really, really helped. So that's something to keep in mind, is that, a picture is really worth 1,000 words. So think about, if you're doing an activity, don't just tell people the instructions, model it, show them, this is what I want you to do. Use photos, and try to use photos actual photos as opposed to using clip art, for example. And there's so many places online now where you can find really high quality photos of things. We don't have to use the line drawings. If you're teaching in your home, you can incorporate real life items, or if you can bring things into the class, you can always act things out and use visual prompts. So these are from some of the teachers that I've worked with who work with literacy level learners, are using things like being able to hold up, mute, unmute, camera on, camera off. The other day, I was volunteering in a beginning level class, and they're using a platform called Schoology. And I was in a breakout room with a couple of students and having them practice. The learners that I was working with were supposed to practice taking the presenter and typing things on the screen. And I was trying to explain, and I was getting nowhere. And finally, I grabbed my mini whiteboard, and I just very quickly drew a visual of, this is what the toolbar looks like. And after 5 minutes of me trying to explain, I drew this and I said, click on this, click this. And all of the learners went, oh, and we're all immediately able to click on it. And then it was, okay, click on this, click on the T. And as soon as I pulled the visuals in, and as you can see, I am not a talented artist. That is not my strength, but it made just a huge immediate difference for when, as soon as I pulled that visual in and stopped trying to use my words to explain. And so, yeah, modeling, using actual pictures is so helpful. Don't, again, try to show, don't just tell. So going ahead and just reviewing those 6 best practices that we talked about, which were teach within a context, make the connection between oral and written language meaningful, build from talent, knowledge, and interest. Repetition is key. You can never repeat it too many times. Focus on communication and make it visual. I would just love to hear, before I start wrapping us up, what are, out of these 6 practices, which ones are you going to use first? What do you think is going to be the most helpful for you in your teaching and tutoring out of these 6? And if you have any ideas for how you do it, how you're going to do it, also feel free to share, because it can be great for people to hear different ideas and maybe be able to grab things that they can do. Yeah, using real life items, the realia. Adding more visuals. There was a fascinating study where they had 2 groups of college students. And so this was quite a higher level, but 2 groups of college students, and they had them listen to the exact same lecture. And one group had just the lecture, just listened, and one group had the lecture plus a few visuals, not many, a few visuals. And 72 hours later, when they did a recall test, the group that had only had the lecture recalled about 10%, and the group that had the lecture with the visual support recalled about 65%. So there was a pretty significant gap among people, among that group, for how much people were able to remember. So great. I'm seeing lots. It looks like this is a pretty wide group. It looks like different things caught other people's ears. Mhm. Breaking words down by syllables. And I saw some people saying, I wish we could have broken things down more. So yeah, always break things down. The Boulder Valley readers are fantastic. Real life, move the laptop around to show items. Like, yeah, let's take advantage of the fact that we are not stuck in a single room. We have a whole kind of house or apartment or even your neighborhood or taking videos when you're out and around and about. You can take videos. And I was talking to somebody who was tutoring a literacy level student, and that was something I had recommended. And she was like, for some reason, the bathroom is like the most fun we've ever had has been going into the bathroom and talking about the bathroom. I don't know why, we're both adults, but there is something very funny about being in the bathroom, both of us being in our bathrooms and practicing and tutoring as we're practicing talking about what's in the bathroom. So great, thank you everybody. So just want to draw your attention to the fact that there are, when you download the PDF of the PowerPoint, there are some different recommendations for free online resources that you might want to check out, including the Bow Valley Readers, which is one of the ones that I was talking about. Some other things that I really like, the Phonics and Phonemic Awareness Instructional Kit from Literacy Minnesota. If you're interested in doing more phonics work, that's taking a text and then adding in more activities that help people practice the language in the text, use the vocabulary to practice phonics in the text. You can get some ideas from there. Also want to highlight LESLA. So LESLA is an international organization that focuses on literacy level adults. So adults learning to read and write for the first time, and saying that this looks really different from children and looks really different from people who are learning to read and write in English who are already literate. So let's make sure that we have a collection of resources and materials and professional development around specifically for people working with this group of learners. So definitely encourage people to check out LESLA. They have so much stuff and you can find just a wealth of resources on there. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here today.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye, Andrea.